We are in the beginning stages of a major mess. Its underpinnings are our loss of trust in our institutions, in our leaders, in our science, and in our facts. The mess is marked by uncertainty, ambiguity, and doubt. Its visible symptoms were the elections that produced President Trump and a Great Britain preparing for Brexit. But it is like a cancer, working silently but effectively to corrode from the inside our sense of what to do, how to act, and who we are. I am standing here in Rome, an eternal city that has seen far more than its fair share of chaos, complexity, and messes. But from the perspective of an American, the chaos of Italy's many governments, split regions, and uncertainties is an eloquent foreshadowing of what many think will happen to the US due to our divisive presidential election, and to both Britain and Europe due to Brexit. The Chinese curse now applies. We do indeed live in interesting times. The mess has a central theme or motif. We seem to have lost our ability to think critically when it is most important for us to do so. Instead, we rely on simplifications and shortcuts. It is not that we cannot think critically. I do not believe the problem has advanced that far, but rather that we have stopped taking the time and making the effort to think critically. We are making bad choices, and those choices begin with how we think. Part of our problem stems from computers and the information age. Over the past 30 plus years, we have become more and more dependent upon computers and upon their ability to process large quantities of data. They have made our lives easier and more efficient, and the power of the computer to help us seems to be ever growing. But that growth has a dark side. We are not computers. We think in thousands of shades of gray. We use emotion, play with ambiguities, and go off on tangents. Computers do none of these, no matter how much data scientists may pretend they do. Instead, it is we who have started adapting our thinking styles to that of the machine. We rely on labels, statistics, and shortcuts. Once upon a time, we used to tell stories. You can't really do that on Twitter, and an emoji is just not the same thing. When we imitate how a computer thinks, we forget that computers allow us to play with the reality that we see, or rather, with the reality that we choose to see. Once upon a time, a camera could be counted upon to take a photograph which captured the reality in front of it. The camera may work the same, but we have many tools like Photoshop which allow us to play with the result. Just because the medium is labeled a photograph does not mean that what you see is a depiction of reality. Instead, it is a depiction of what the photographer, who may or may not be a digital artist, wants you to see. All we can count upon is that we are seeing a work of art. And like any work of art, what we bring to it as a viewer in making our interpretation may or may not coincide with what the artist intended. First, when the artist produced it, and second, when the artist made it available to us so that we could see it. What tends to get lost is the underlying reality which that photo supposedly depicted. Our trust that we are truly seeing reality has been broken. This lack of trust in a photo is an apt metaphor for the lack of trust which underlies our present-day mess of uncertainty and doubts. I believe and hope to demonstrate to you today that this mess of ours, the lack of trust, the uncertainty, the doubts, are the result of three catalysts at work. First is our seemingly limitless addiction to simplicity. The second is our preference to hide processes and mechanisms inside black boxes. No, not the airplane kind, the logical kind. The third is our ever-increasing reliance on truthiness, the truth that we feel is right, over any kind of truth based on facts. The addiction to simplicity fosters our use of black boxes in the form of labels or categories. Our preference for simple labels then fuels our reliance on truthiness, since feelings require few facts and even less inquiry. Truthiness, in turn, inspires us to create more simplicity. It is a vicious circle which keeps feeding on itself, and at its core is our loss of trust. We simplify because we cannot or will not deal with the complexities and interwoven interrelationships which swirl all around us. We are human. We have cognitive limits. For example, we can only deal with 5 to 9 things at once. You may have heard of the magic number 7, plus or minus 2. Any more, and we hit overload. So our answer to complexity is to simplify. We like to make use of labels and categories. In doing so, we are black boxing the mechanisms, the processes, the questions, and the ambiguities that go into our selection of any particular label. We hide all the messiness in the black box, and then we rely on the label instead of the underlying story. Labels are simple. Stories can be quite complex. Our preference for the computer and for efficiency says, go for the simple. So labels and black boxes it is. Somehow, we have slipped into a pattern of preferring truthiness to truth. Truthiness was coined by the late-night comedian or social commentator Stephen Colbert to describe our assertion that facts, descriptions, or opinions which seem right to us or which align with our feelings, those we will describe as true, without regard to whether they correspond to some kind of objective reality. Truthiness is personal. It is relativism at its peak, but truthiness seems to govern. If it feels right, it is right. If it feels true, it is true. That's truthiness. And remember, this is a vicious circle. Each element helps and feeds on the others. We go round and round. But there is a cost to all this. The cost is trust. When simplicity isn't obvious, when it doesn't just present itself to us, what we do, we create it. Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, the simplicity that we deal with is actually our own construction, a product of our minds. What we are doing is creating our own reality. We see the world. We process the world. But the way we process it is to tell ourselves a story. We tell ourselves a story which makes sense of what it is that we think we see, of what it is that we think we need to deal with. And most of the time, what we do is we tell a very simple story. We announce, at least to ourselves, the world is X, or the world is Y, or the world is Z. What we do is filter the reality that we see. First, we limit our field of attention. What we want to do is narrow the context of what it is that we're choosing to deal with. Then, we limit the factors to be considered. We assert a set of boundaries or of constraints. Then we predict likely outcomes given the boundaries and constraints that we have just imposed. In effect, at this point, what we've done is construct in our heads a set of multiple realities, each reflecting the boundaries. Finally, we pick among those multiple realities. By choosing from among our predictions, we have taken the complex or complicated reality that we first encountered and turned it into a simple construct. And what we do is then deal with the simple. Let's take a real-life example. About 5 years ago, the New York City police raided a shop in Chinatown, and they raided it for selling counterfeit goods. What they charged were high-quality, hard to distinguish from the real thing, replicas of Louis Vuitton and Gucci handbags. Just this past year, the Hong Kong police, working with Gucci, made a similar arrest. But in both instances, the counterfeit goods were made of paper, and they were intended to be burned at a funeral so that the spirit of the handbags could accompany the deceased on their journey. Clearly, the definition of counterfeit, which the police were relying on, and the definition of counterfeit, which the storekeepers understood, was very different. The community which the shopkeepers served was outraged. What about our traditions? Eventually, both Gucci and Louis Vuitton and the police backed off. They all learned that the definition of a counterfeit may not be as simple as they thought. Their construct had failed them. Then we have the many, many examples of so-called fake news. The headline I'm showing you is but one of millions of examples. Once upon a time, we called these things lies or propaganda. Now, when they appear, if they manage to appeal to someone's truthiness, and if they're simple enough, they may get repeated over and over again, and may even get reported in the mainstream press. All that appears is the report itself, where it came from, how it came to be, who it is that originated it. All that is hidden inside a black box. But if it seems right, if it feels right, it's a truthy. And in many cases, the truthy could be fake news. This reliance on truthies can have real-life consequences. A few months ago, a man appeared at a Washington, D.C. pizzeria with a semi-automatic weapon and declared he was going to search the place. He wanted to find and free a set of sex slaves that supposedly were part of the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. He was motivated by what he believed to be the truth, but it was merely fake news. Now, before you decide that you are more than capable of sorting the real from the fake, or at least that kind, I want you to imagine that you're a shopper at a mall called the Mills of Jersey Gardens. It is the day after Christmas, and you are there with your children to return a few unwanted items and to scour the mall for post-holiday bargains. In the food court, there are sounds of arguments and then a sharp, loud noise. There are cries of gunshots. Then the music on the loudspeakers is interrupted with, "Attention mall shoppers, please leave the mall now. Due to an emergency, the mall is now closed. Everyone should make their way to the nearest exit. Go to your car by walking around the mall, not through it. Please be careful, but please evacuate now." Then there are more cries of gunshots. As you make your way out, you see the SWAT team on its way in. You and your children are scared, and you are only worried about how to get them safely to your car and away from the mall. You make your escape. Breathless, you get home. You turn on the TV set and discover that the gunshots? No, they were the sound of a chair being broken because some idiot stood on it. So what was the truth? Was it the gunshots or the chair? I need to tell you that 45,000 shoppers and 3,000 workers were evacuated, and more than 500 police and emergency personnel dispatched. 2 people were seriously hurt during the evacuation. The hunt for the gunman made national news. I suspect that if you were one of those 48,000 plus shoppers and were asked in 10 years to retell the tale, you will tell whoever asks you that you and the children fled gunshots. The broken chair will be gone from your mind. Now the rest of us, we will gladly accept the fact that there was no gunshot at all, just a broken chair. The same facts, but 2 very different interpretations. The rest of us will rely on, it was reported. But if you were one of those shoppers, you will rely on, I lived it. This idea of multiple interpretations from the same underlying situation is called the Rashomon effect, after a very popular Japanese movie by that name from 1950. In the movie, the story of a murder is told from 4 different perspectives, and the viewer is led to understand that there might indeed be 4 different truths. In our lives, the use of labels and categories can also lead to the Rashomon effect. Each of us will bring a different perspective, a different set of prior facts, a different set of prior understandings, and a different history to our encounter with any given label. Most of the meaning that we will derive will be from this mindset that's in our heads and not from the label itself. The truth of the New Jersey gunshots is just a simple example. Was it a gunshot or was it a chair? Depends what's in your head. We use labels and categories almost without thought. In doing so, we assume that the people we are speaking with or to will derive the same meaning and the same inferences that we do from the label itself. This can be a very bad assumption. All too often, when one of us sees an object, it will call to mind something very different than what someone else has called to mind. The 48,000 people evacuated from that New Jersey shopping mall have a very different impression of the place, or from seeing a picture of it, than all the rest of us. The police and the shopkeepers had very different impressions of what the word counterfeit meant when it came to those funereal goods. So I ask you, please look at this picture. Now look away. Now look again. What is it that you see? Are you sure? Did you see the peasant girl? Or did you see the man? Or did you see both? Maybe you saw both at the same time. It's ambiguous. A problem with ambiguity and our lack of certainty is that the simplicity that we're seeking may not be shared by other people. It's not that they do not share our goal, it's that they see something different than what we saw. Some people will see the peasant girl. Other people will see the man. We will tell to ourselves and to others not the story that the others around us see, but the story that we see. It is our truthy that matters. Of course, context matters too. Clearly, we react differently to the piece of pizza when it is on a plate in the restaurant than we do when it is lying on a sewer grate. But then again, my dog may not choose to make that same distinction. And I leave the picture on the right to your imagination.
Meaning comes from a combination of information and exformation. Information you're familiar with. That is exactly what is provided to you. When a word says something, what you know it to mean is the information. Exformation, however, is something quite different. Exformation is meaning which is derived from contextual clues. We look at a representation, we take into account the context in which we're looking at it, and we process it in our mind. Most of the meaning comes from what we see in the context. That could be very different from what you think the representation otherwise tells us. For example, look at this billboard found in Uzbekistan. I don't know about you, but I find the words good luck to be rather ominous.
Remember, we have our vicious circle and its ability to fuel itself at the expense of trust. The circle comes together and it affects all of us when we encounter what I call the chasm of dissonance. It is a chasm because of the wide gap in the effectiveness of a label or symbol when it is used inside a well-defined community compared to when that same label or symbol is used by insiders in dealing with outsiders. In the United States, the obvious example of this kind of chasm could be abortion rights, gun control, evolution versus creationism, or Clinton versus Trump. In Europe, similar examples can be found in the entire issue of Brexit, the future of the Eurobloc, and in immigration rights. With all these issues, when insiders speak with one another using labels, categories, and jargon, they are able to be very effective. The labels and categories and jargon have defined meanings. If you look at the graph I have displayed, insiders are on the green line. The greater the amount of simplification they use, the more effective that it seems to be, if that is, they are addressing other insiders. By contrast, when they deal with those who are not on the inside, the black line seems to govern. Notice that somewhere to the right of the 50% mark, the black line takes a nosedive. Effectiveness goes negative. That negative territory is the chasm of dissonance.
Perhaps the most noteworthy example of a chasm of dissonance happened in 1985 when Coca-Cola attempted to introduce what they called New Coke. The insiders were the Coca-Cola executives and their marketing agency, etc. They measured taste. And from that one variable, they decided that the general public preferred a sweeter tasting cola. What did they do? They got rid of the traditional old Coke and they introduced New Coke. Now, to the outsiders, New Coke was a travesty. It didn't matter what it tasted like. What the Coca-Cola company had forgot was all of the other variables that went along with drinking Coke. People identified themselves as Coca-Cola drinkers versus Pepsi drinkers. Coke was part of their lives. This was not the Coke that they understood Coke to be. After roughly 3 months, Coca-Cola gave up. New Coke was no more. Old Coke was back. The chasm of dissonance had won.
It is a chasm because of the tremendous difference between the insiders and the outsiders. So how does this effect happen? Let me give you a story of perfect simplicity that went on between two insiders because I think it makes the mechanism fairly obvious. In 1862, Victor Hugo was on vacation and he wanted to know how his novel Les Mis was selling. He sent a one-character telegram to his publisher. It was a question mark. The publisher, in turn, replied with a single character, an exclamation point. This told Hugo about his great success. It was simplification at its best. A single character conveyed all the information that each of those two participants needed to know. But what would an outsider have made of this communication? The question mark would only convey that Hugo had a question. The exclamation mark was much too vague and would have probably conveyed no information at all. Between Hugo and his agent, the simplification was highly effective, but that same simplification would have been completely ineffective for virtually everyone else. At the left-hand side of the curve, the very act of trying to simplify the complicated and the complex is likely to produce phrases, words, models, or stories that convey meaning through metaphors or analogies. To insiders, these metaphors will trigger a specific set of common stories. The insiders will share those stories. Some of them may be shared with the outsiders, some of them may not. This kind of simplification through metaphor and analogy is not intended to produce a one-to-one mapping. The label used or the category evoked is still vague enough, ambiguous enough, or sufficiently context-dependent to evoke a multitude of meanings across its recipients, the Rashomon effect. And indeed, the outsiders may be inspired by the metaphors used to see a completely different but highly useful idea. Much innovation actually begins just this way. As we make the simplifications tighter, smaller, more nuanced, we come to rely more and more on the meanings that are previously understood and shared by insiders. Outsiders who do not have the same sense of shared things will rely on their own very different understandings, and as a result, meanings diverge. If the participants in a dialogue were open to understanding this curve and to understanding the Rashomon effect, then an exploration of commonalities and differences could be productive. But seldom is there such openness. Instead, what happens in the chasm is a fairly nasty characteristic. There is an insistence that the personal truthing is instead an absolute truth. The more that the two sides argue, the greater the conviction each will express in their own truthing. Emotions will take over. Those who do not share one side's expressed point of view are instead labeled as evil, ugly, or having flaws of character or of personality or of mental health. It's charged that the others are denying the obvious. Whenever you hear such things, beware, you have arrived at the chasm of dissonance. You cannot deal with the chasm unless you recognize that you are in or near it. And there are three very easily observed signals for this. First, when the others with whom you are trying to deal start referring to emotion or personalities rather than talking about the subject itself, that is a very strong clue that you've entered the chasm. Second, when the explanations offered take the form of category membership, for example, Trump is a businessman and all businessmen put profits first, and their explanations are not done using a how or a why, again, you know you're at or in the chasm. Finally, when narratives are told in the abstract as if they apply regardless of context, and whenever you raise context, you're told instead that things are abstract and absolute, the chasm is rearing its head. Once you find yourself in the chasm of dissonance, you need to remember that attempting to deal with those on the other side will require finding a passageway out of the chasm itself. Giving the other side what you believe to be evidence that you are right or correct will only inflame emotions and will make the dissonance even harder. The same holds with attempting to make what you think to be logical arguments. The two sides in the chasm do not see the facts the same way. They do not agree on how whatever it is that they see or facts are to be interpreted. And they fail to give the other side the notion that holding a differing view could possibly be legitimate. So above all, do not respond to expressions of emotion with emotion. It will just inflame the situation. You instead need to find a way out of the chasm. The only way to escape the chasm of dissonance is to make moves towards what was the left-hand side of the graph. You need to go away from simplifications and toward the area where both sides might find some use from a shared metaphor. The path forward lies in asking questions, lots and lots of questions. The idea is to get the other side to open their set of black boxes. Then you need to open your set of black boxes. You want each to reveal the process by which things, items, people, or situations got labeled. Once the labeling process is open for discussion, there is the possibility for change. That possibility does not exist while the black box of any given label or category is allowed to remain sealed and opaque. You need to ask why, ask how, in what context, in what sense is there a background that's being assumed that I or you may not be aware of. It is the questions that are going to make all the difference. To give you a useful metaphor, do not try to deal with situations as if you were a megapixel, high-quality digital camera. Your goal is not fidelity or accuracy. Instead, try to think of yourself as a broken, but still somewhat functioning Polaroid camera. You produce a picture, but the picture is only effective to the extent that it leads the people viewing it to ask questions and to generate answers. The questions that get asked help to develop whatever understanding it is that follows. If you don't ask questions, then either you accept what you are shown at face value, or you assume that your personal interpretation of the picture is indeed the correct interpretation. But, as we learned from the paper counterfeits, the fake news, and the gunshots at the New Jersey Mall, we each choose our interpretations, and we may not be making the best choices. How we answer the questions, the very questions that we ask about how, why, background, context, etc., will help to determine the narrative that we then tell in order to make sense of the picture. And making sense is critical. The only way we can cope with uncertainty, ambiguity, and change is to tell a story. That story needs to weave together to make sense and to form a narrative. It needs to be coherent. And it is the narrative that will determine what our next actions will be. It is the narrative that gives us clues as to how to guide our path through the mess of uncertainty and doubt. It is the narrative that gives us our way forward. So we must remember. Thank you.